In just a few days, the Olympic flame will make its way to the Seine River, where tens of thousands of athletes converge to mark the opening of another Summer Games. The biggest sporting event in the world has not been on American soil for nearly 30 years. So in this episode, we're going to look back to Atlanta as I ask, when did the USA last host the Olympics? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. I'm joined on this episode by someone who can perhaps speak on this better than almost anyone on the planet. He's a historian, a TV commentator, and co-founder and former president of the International Society of Olympic Historians. His books include The Complete Book of the Olympics, and we'll link you to that in the show notes. And welcome to the podcast, David Wallechinsky.
Thank you very much.
Really, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, particularly as we were just talking about your busy few weeks coming up in France. So it's great that you could find some time to join us for this.
Okay, I'm ready for everything.
Famous last words. I guess some of our listeners might not be too familiar with Olympics history. So remind us, how many times has the USA hosted the Summer Olympic Games?
The United States has hosted the Summer Olympics 4 times and the Winter Olympics 4 times. So the only country that comes near is France with 6. The United States first hosted the Summer Olympics in 1904 in St. Louis, a controversial event. Then Los Angeles, 1932, during the Depression, which was difficult. Los Angeles again in 1984, which was quite a success. And then Atlanta in 1996. The Los Angeles will host the games again in 2028.
Yeah, it feels like, having hosted it twice in the USA in a relatively short time, there was maybe a little bit of sort of Olympics fatigue set in, which is why it's been so long since they've bid to host it again.
I think that the International Olympic Committee tries to spread the Olympics around the world. That way people get exposed to it in person, even though, let's be honest, 98% of the people follow the Olympics either on television or on the internet. Still, it's nice to have them somewheres. The problem that the International Olympic Committee has faced recently is that a couple of the hosts have not done well. The Sochi Winter Olympics were corrupt. And then the Rio Olympics, though the hosts were friendly, was very poorly organized. So the International Olympic Committee decided we need to be safe. When they got bids for both Paris and Los Angeles, they said, let's give it to both of them. Paris 2024, Los Angeles 2028.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Atlanta then. As you say, they were the last city in the US to host the Summer Olympic Games back in '96. I'm just curious about that decision, mainly from the US to sort of bid with Atlanta, because, Los Angeles had hosted it twice at that point. It feels like they had the infrastructure, they had the setup to do it, and a proven track record of doing it. What was it about Atlanta that they decided made a better candidate at that time?
The United States Olympic Committee chooses a bid city, which then goes up against cities from other countries. The contestants, so to speak, were Atlanta, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Nashville, and San Francisco. And the choice of Atlanta was quite controversial because it was a relatively small city that didn't really have the infrastructure. And it won, as it turned out, quite easily over Minneapolis. Then Atlanta had to go against the rest of the world. I'm sorry to say that what stood out for Atlanta was bribery. The Atlanta organizers just gave gifts to IOC, International Olympic Committee members. And they later admitted, maybe some of these gifts were excessive. That's putting it mildly. But they said, look, we had no choice. All the other cities were doing it. They were up against Toronto, Melbourne, and the main one they were up against was Athens, because it was supposed to be the 100th anniversary of the first modern Olympics, 1896 in Athens. But Atlanta caught a break, which was that the Greeks were arrogant. They said, we don't have to show you anything. We deserve these Olympics. These are our Olympics. 1996, and they really alienated a lot of members of the International Olympic Committee. Meanwhile, the Atlanta organizers spent quite a bit of money bribing IOC members. They went and visited them at their homes. They flew them out to Atlanta. They gave them ridiculous, huge number of Cabbage Patch dolls. They gave them money to do shopping sprees. It was kind of silly, and they could travel on their way to visit Atlanta or back. They could stop at Walt Disney World, Miami, Honolulu, New York, and do shopping there at the expense of the Atlanta Organizing Committee. First class travel, and then they made it clear that if IOC members had any requests, they would do what they could. So first class travel, you have a relative who needs health care, you have a relative who needs some training, go to a hospital, we'll take care of it, we'll pay for it. So they got the bid. Atlanta had a rough time. The way voting for the Olympics goes with the International Olympic Committee is that, in this case, maybe there are five, 6 candidates. The one on the first round, unless somebody gets a majority, the one that has the least votes is eliminated for the next round, and so on until somebody gets a majority. Atlanta in the second round, in the first 2 rounds, trailed Athens. In the third round, Atlanta trailed both Athens and Melbourne. But when it came to the final round, Atlanta won 51-35.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of that way of voting, is that you don't get the city that most people want the most. You get the city that is the most broadly accepted. Because, as you say, as each last place drops off, you're kind of then divvying out those votes, and so you could technically come second to last in every round, but
Yes.
pick up enough votes from each country that drops off that you then get enough in the last row.
In fact, what happened with the Atlanta bid was the vote was in 1990, and the last 2 to go out were Toronto and Melbourne, which were English-speaking countries, and were quite resentful of the way the Athens organizers, bid committee, had acted. So they just went to whoever was left, and that was Atlanta.
But you mentioned that there was almost a competitive requirement to go above and beyond, to put it mildly, to win over the judges. Now, obviously, it sounds like Atlanta might have taken it to the next level here. But was there a way at that time to actually run a fair, contest?
No, there wasn't. That was the way the IOC operated. It's true that Atlanta went above and beyond. For example, by that time, bid cities were keeping a file on each IOC member. What do they like? What do they don't like? What Atlanta did, which was painfully clever, was when they flew IOC members out to the United States, they gave them a driver security guard. And the Atlanta organizers arranged with the drivers and security guards to schmooze with the IOC member. And then afterwards, they questioned them, what did he say? What did he want? What did he like? That was innovative, to actually have drivers and security guards giving information to the bid committee.
Yeah, that definitely feels it's something a little underhanded about that. But do you think that things have changed and improved since '96?
Yes, definitely the IOC was forced to change. In fact, the Atlanta people really weren't investigated at first. What happened was there was a scandal exposed about how Salt Lake City got the 2002 Olympics. And when that came out, everything changed. In a way, almost too much, because IOC members are not allowed to even visit a host city, which
Wow.
it would be nice if they could. But they changed the whole way of doing it. And it was only after the Salt Lake City scandal that people went back and started investigating Atlanta. There were congressional hearings. And then the whole story of what Atlanta had done came out and was made public.
And so what were the repercussions? Was anyone held to account?
No. I mean, with Salt Lake City, yes, there were IOC members who had to resign because they had taken excessive bribes.
Yeah.
But with Atlanta, no, nobody was held to account.
Let's look a little bit at the reasons why Atlanta may have actually been chosen as the host city and some of the benefits that might bring to a host city. Is there an argument that actually a city like Atlanta and even Minneapolis, there's a real opportunity for regeneration if you're selected as the Olympics host city? And is that part of the reason why they bid?
Yes, I think the key word you used was opportunity. Because often cities do not take advantage of that opportunity. Atlanta was an example. For example, in building stadiums, they destroyed them afterwards. Now, the International Olympic Committee is very strong on sustainability. They want those venues to be reused or put to good use afterwards. That was not so much the case for the 1996 games. I think that the Atlanta organizers hoped that it would bring awareness around the world to Atlanta and would help them host future events. But it backfired because, frankly, the Atlanta 1996 Olympics became, for the Olympic movement, the template on how not to organize the Olympics. It was done so poorly. That this is what you don't do. And so because the whole world saw that, it backfired in Atlanta. Nobody wanted to have another international event in Atlanta. So that was quite unfortunate. I have many personal experiences of what happened.
And I guess, tapping into some of that personal experience of yours, where do you think the biggest failings were during those games?
The first thing that was wrong, the organizer was a man named Billy Payne, who didn't know anything about the Olympics. He was trying to promote Atlanta, which is fine. But he didn't really understand the Olympics. And the organizers of the Atlanta Games really didn't understand the rest of the world, that this was an international event. Everything was pushed to how it would impress people in Atlanta. And, as somebody said to me, Atlanta, a foreign country, is New York and California. They just didn't get it. And as it got closer, for example, it was clear that they didn't understand how the media worked and how result systems work. And so the IOC became nervous. The International Olympic Committee became nervous. They said to the Atlanta organizers, you have to bring in some media specialists to go over your system that you prepared and make suggestions. So they did. I was not one of them, but I've talked to people who were. They went in, they told them what was wrong, and Billy Payne and the other Atlanta organizers said, it's none of your business. You do your work, we'll do ours. We'll do what we're doing, which is organizing the games. You do your media. Well, as soon as the games began, it was a catastrophe. The first thing that affected most people was the transportation. They didn't understand how many people would be going around, how you move people around. The Atlanta organizers hired people who weren't from Atlanta to drive the buses. These people didn't know Atlanta. They didn't know one-way streets. They didn't know shortcuts. They didn't know what was going to be closed. And they were so poorly paid and taken care of that within a couple of days of the opening ceremony, a huge number of them quit, which made everything even harder. The transportation was a disaster. Also, the volunteers were not well trained. I encountered this the very first day on the opening ceremony. I was calling the opening ceremony live for U.S. radio. And so my partner and I, we arrived really early. And we went to the volunteers and said, where is the media entrance? They didn't know. We went, some of them were actually rude to us. I'm in charge of corporate people, media. And finally, a fifth person had educated herself to know what the stadium was like. And she directed us to where we were supposed to go. But it was disturbing. It was very hot. People needed water. They were selling water. Wow. They weren't giving it away. And this was way different than previous Olympics and Olympics that came afterwards. I will give you the example of the computer results problem. I was covering swimming. And my way of covering swimming was to, in the morning, to read the results of the qualifying round and then make a chart so that I knew each swimmer in the final of every event if they were a fast starter or a fast finisher. That way, because I was doing live for the final, that way I knew if an American, a U.S. swimmer, was in fifth place halfway through the race, I could say, don't worry, he or she finishes quickly. Don't worry. Mm-hmm. So the morning of the first day of swimming, I went to the press center and to results of the qualifying. They weren't there. I said, what happened? Where are the results? And I was told, oh, we don't have the results of any of the events that aren't here. You have to go to the swimming venue, which was far away. I said, you got to be kidding, because all you have to do is push a button and it gets sent to the main press center. They push another button, print them out. It was easy. They hadn't done that. And so I ended up having to go to the swimming venue 2 hours early in order to prepare my work. And this was a continuing catastrophe. I give you another example. Fortunately, I was from the United States. One night they told me, could you cover diving? We'll check in on you every 15, 20 minutes and you'll give us an update. Fine. I go there and there's no results board. You couldn't see what score a diver had gotten or anything. And I was in a panic. The volunteers were Americans, and they went, can we help you? And I explained the problem. They ran down to the judges' table, wrote down the results for the Americans, and ran back up and gave them to me. Well, if you were not from the United States, you were following divers from another country, what were you going to do? There was nothing. Yeah. There were no results. So this was a continuous problem.
It kind of makes me wonder why they even chose to progress with Atlanta in the first place, because the responsibility that comes and the opportunities that come with being selected as the host city. If you're not going to follow through with that, what possible reasons were there for even going ahead with it in the first place?
Well, Billy Payne and the Atlanta organizers, they were promoting Atlanta and they were promoting themselves. Mm. I brought you the Olympics, and people who encountered Billy Payne found him arrogant, incompetent, but it didn't matter. And from the International Olympic Committee position, it was automatically too late. You couldn't change, particularly because all the sponsors and particularly the TV networks from around the world had already set everything up. Mm-hmm. They weren't going to move everything. So there was no choice but to go ahead.
And I think actually, as a Brit, perhaps I'm biased, but I think maybe one of the impacts of all of this from Atlanta is that when you look at how a bid like London was orchestrated and then sort of planned, that felt very different from what you're telling me about Atlanta, in that, Seb Cohen himself was an Olympian and it kind of leading that project. So there was a real kind of genuine passion for what he was doing. And you really got a much greater sense of collaboration than what you're suggesting there was from Atlanta. So, yeah. Perhaps that's one of the silver linings in sort of the shambles of the Atlanta Games, is that it really kind of gave a bit of a case study to future organisers as to, what not to do.
Oh, yeah. I mean, absolutely. The very next Olympics after Atlanta were in Sydney, Australia. It was fantastic. They definitely learned what had gone wrong in Atlanta. Everybody was friendly. Everybody showed you where to go. There were signs telling you where to go. That was another problem with Atlanta, which was where are you supposed to go? My experience going to the Olympics was if you took public transportation, there'd be a little on top of each stop, there'd be a little picture of any sport that was done there. They didn't do that in Atlanta. So if you're wandering around, you didn't know where to get off. This was before GPS. And yes, Sydney, they learned their lesson. London went well. Tokyo, despite everything that they ran into, like the pandemic, it was at least extremely well organized.
Yeah.
And volunteers in both Australia and in Japan were well trained. So lessons were learned. What was also frustrating about the computer system was that it had worked at the last Olympics in Barcelona. And there you had 4 years later, it's in the United States, an advanced, IT country, and the whole system went down. It was crazy.
Yeah, which I guess is just indicative of how much those games were really supported behind the scenes, for those failings to sort of happen. In terms of, the world's reaction to Atlanta being selected as the host city, I'm assuming at the time, the general public probably didn't realize that all of this was happening, behind the scenes. Was there an optimism or was there a sort of skepticism about Atlanta as the host?
I think for most countries around the world, it was just curiosity.
Mm.
They didn't know about Atlanta. Most of them had never heard of it. And so, they were open-minded. And it wasn't until people started dealing with it that, it was frustrating. I remember sitting with foreign members of the media, and they were so frustrated. How can I get to this? How can I get that? And what can you say? These Americans. I'm going, no, it's not the Americans. Don't you remember 1984 Los Angeles? Everybody was happy. It worked well. Please, don't blame all of us. But so it was really not until the games began that the rest of the world realized that things were wrong. And of course, the biggest thing was the bombing. And that, there was a bombing, what was it, July 27th, I think. And I had, I was working in the was called the International Broadcast Center. And I had just done a late, up till midnight, live radio interview on the other side of this park. There was a park right in front of the main press center and all of the Olympic venues. And people didn't realize that park was not part of the Olympics. It was run by the city of Atlanta. And there was an assumption that there was security in this park, which there wasn't. They were having concerts there, people were selling things and so forth. So I walked across after this interview, across what was called Centennial Park. I went into the International Broadcast Center. I was collecting material, and I heard this explosion. And I knew right away it was a bomb because I'd heard bombs before. And I discovered later that I had walked across the spot where the bomb went off 20 minutes earlier, which was chilling. And then there was a panic, of course. One person was killed, many were injured. Turkish journalist had a heart attack running to cover it. It was a terrible event. And there was this panic. What if there's going to be more?
Yeah.
So the local authorities, including the organizing committee and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, they zeroed in on this one guy, Richard Jewell. Richard Jewell was a security guard. He had found the bomb and alerted the authorities. And he appeared to be a hero. And then they decided to blame him without actually charging him with a crime. And the goal was to make it seem like they had solved the problem. We've got the guy. He was never charged. He was completely innocent. They destroyed this man's life, Richard Jewell. And later were forced to apologize, and the media, which had just picked up on it right away, was forced to pay damages to him repeatedly. In the end, it turned out Richard Jewell was a hero. But The actual person who had set the bomb was a man named Eric Rudolph, who was an anti-abortion, anti-gay activist and committed 3 more terrorist attacks after Atlanta.
Wow.
So this was the of all the bad things that happened in Atlanta, that was the worst.
Yeah, and from everything that you've said so far, the Olympic Park bombing is generally the event that's remembered from the Atlanta 96 games because of how tragic it was, but it kind of epitomizes just the failings generally from the organizing committee, from even the city of Atlanta, in just in creating a safe, structured and just well organized games. And this is the problem when you have hundreds of thousands of people converging on a city at one time. It's a security risk, and it just doesn't feel like that was managed.
Right. Well, obviously, ever since the Munich bombings of 1972, security has been a major issue.
Mm.
Continues to be. But it's very difficult, and one of the reasons that the International Olympic Committee is going with big cities that have a history of organizing large events is because you don't just defend the venues. For example, at the 2008 Beijing Olympics, there was a man who killed an American the day after the opening ceremony. He happened to be the father-in-law of the coach of the volleyball team. And this murder happened not at an Olympic venue, but at a tourist site. It happened to be a tourist site that symbolized Western imperialism. But now what you have to do, for example, Paris 2024 or Los Angeles 2028, you have to provide security not just at Olympic sites, but everywhere in the city, which is very expensive and very difficult to do.
So when we pivot more towards the actual games themselves, because I feel like we haven't actually talked much about sport in this
Right.
podcast. What were the sort of big highlights and the real kind of standout moments at these games?
Well,
From a sporting perspective.
yeah, well, there were a lot of good things at the 1996 Olympics. For example, a lot of new sports were introduced: beach volleyball, mountain biking, lightweight rowing, which had never been done, softball, women's soccer, women's football. For the first time in men's football, three professionals older than 23 were allowed to compete as long as they'd never been in the World Cup. So there were a lot of innovations. The opening ceremony was highlighted by Muhammad Ali helping to light the Olympic torch. He was already quite ill. And then my favorite thing about a lot about the opening ceremony was tacky, but there was a wonderful innovation that the Atlanta organizers did, which was that traditionally the athletes enter through a tunnel and they come up onto the field by country. And what they did in Atlanta was, instead of coming through a tunnel, they came in from above. And so it was like, for most athletes at the Olympics aren't going to win a medal. They're just going to do their best.
Mm-hmm.
And this was their moment. They were up above. Everybody's looking at them. They were heroes. It was a wonderful innovation. I thought it was great. There were many, many heroes, of course, in many sports. Each country has their own heroes. From the U.S. point of view, the home team point of view, 1996 was the first time that the women's gymnastics team won the team gold medal. That was a very big event. Amy Van Dyken, a swimmer, won more gold medals than anybody else at those Olympics, 4 gold medals in swimming. Carl Lewis won the long jump for the 4th time, which was amazing. He became only the 3rd person in the history of the Olympics in any sport to win the same individual event 4 times. That was,
Wow.
and the long jump is, everybody tries to see how far they can jump at some point. It's not like luge, where not many people do it, or the breaststroke or something like that. It's or the individual medley swimming, canoeing. No, the long jump, boy, to win the long jump 4 times was amazing. And then
Mm.
before the Atlanta Olympics, no runner had ever won the 200 meters and the 400 meters at the same Olympics. And yet, as it happened for both the women and the men. In the women, Marie-Josée Pérec of France won the 200, 400, and Michael Johnson won the 200 and 400 and set a world record. That
Mm.
was very exciting. So there were some real highlights. And one of the, most people don't pay attention to this, but I thought it was great. 79 different countries won medals. That was a record.
Wow.
And athletes from 53 different countries won gold medals. It was wonderful. You could see the Olympics spreading out and bringing in success for more and more countries. So that was great.
Yeah, and that's really awesome to hear actually, because normally, I mean, America have had such a consistent sort of success at the Olympics. I would have assumed perhaps the opposite, in that it being held in the USA, sometimes home country gets a bit more galvanized to perform well, and I actually would have expected there to be a greater concentration of medals for the US. So that's actually a really awesome stat.
The United States did win the most gold medals and the most medals, 101. But if you look carefully at Olympic results, the United States wins a disproportionate amount of their gold medals and medals in 2 sports, track and field and swimming.
Hmm.
So there are other countries where there's other sports that are more important.
Yeah. And when we kind of look back at the Olympics, what do you think sort of the lasting legacy of the Atlanta Games will be?
Well, unfortunately, as I said, within the Olympic movement, the legacy of the 1996 Olympics is this is how you don't do it. And any country that or city that's organizing can look at Atlanta, don't do this, don't do that, don't do that. I think that the other thing was it was a good lesson for the International Olympic movement that you have to start monitoring what an organizing committee is doing. Had a lot of problems with Rio. There, the problem was corruption.
Mm.
The money went into a few pockets. And so, now the International Olympic Committee pays more attention to monitoring how things are going as the organization goes along.
Mm.
Unfortunately, Atlanta, as I said, got rid of the Olympic Stadium. Now you can go, most cities, you can go to the Olympic Stadium. I went to the Olympic Stadium that was used at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics. It's still there and functioning.
Really?
Yeah, they do a lot of concerts there also. And, Atlanta didn't do that. They changed it, became a baseball field. They named it after Ted Turner. So the legacy of that was unfortunate. I would think, unfortunately, the good thing is a lot of the legacy is the athletes themselves and their performances.
Yeah. And of course, that's what I'm sure the IOC would rather people focus on, are the achievements on the field, or in the pool, as it were. But it's to sort of bring us to a close. We've touched very lightly on the fact that LA has hosted twice before and will do in 4 years. St. Louis hosted way back in the early 1900s, and Atlanta, of course, as we've discussed, has hosted. Is there a US city who have not yet hosted an Olympic Games who you would like to see host an Olympic Games?
Well, there's some I would like, but I can't imagine it happening. I think that if there was one city that deserved it, it would be Chicago, because they were given the 1904 Olympics, but they were taken away because St. Louis was holding a World's Fair, and they said, if you go ahead with the Olympics in Chicago, we will stage an alternative competitive event. And so the President of the United States, Teddy Roosevelt, intervened, and eventually the IOC agreed to shift from Chicago to St. Louis. Unfortunately, the last time Chicago bid for the Olympics, they did such a poor job that they were eliminated in the first round of voting. So because of the security, because of the expense, it's hard to imagine another U.S. city hosting the Olympics at this point.
Mm.
Texas, where there's great interest in sport, of course, is just too hot,
Yeah.
frankly. And other cities, I can't imagine it. Sorry.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Well, there we go. Chicago, maybe 2044, perhaps.
Right.
Bring it on. But yeah, no, I have to say, actually, I have, for all this talk of Atlanta, I was lucky enough to visit Atlanta for a few days back in 2012, and I went to the Centennial Park, and they've got a really sort of nice memorial there now. I think, if I remember correctly, they've put the names of those injured and killed
Hmm. Hmm.
engraved on the concrete tiles, I believe.
Hmm. Hmm.
So yeah, anyone that has a chance to visit Atlanta, which is actually a really lovely city, go and check out sort of Centennial Park as well, because there's a really nice memorial there for that. I think we could go on for a lot longer talking about the Olympics. I'm sure you can, David, but we're gonna wrap up this episode there. And thank you so much for joining me for this. Anyone listening, if you've liked what we've discussed on this episode, I'm going to put some extra links in the show notes so you can sort of listen and watch and enjoy more stuff on the Olympics. And if anyone wants to connect with you, David, where can they do that?
Oh, it's D. Wallechinsky, no dot, D. Wallechinsky at gmail.com.
Wonderful. And you can find me on X via This Is the Hef and on LinkedIn as well. Just search for Liam Heffernan because that's my name. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this. And if you could give us a follow, that's awesome for us. But it also means all future episodes will appear in your feed. And don't forget, if you really like what we do, we are on Patreon. There's a link to that in the show notes. So go ahead and support us there if you can. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.